Hello, MBA hopefuls. We are on the air with MBA Waves, your weekly vidcast talking all things business and education, streaming live every Tuesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, bringing you tons of great tips to help you get into top-ranked MBA programs and getting up close and personal with many of the schools that we host on the show, as well as professionals in the space. And it's also a place where you can get all your answers, all your questions answered. So if you like this week's episode or any of the previous week's episodes, don't forget to like and subscribe. Today, this is episode 92, and we're talking about the latest trends in MBAs in 2023. And we're going to get into MBA in tough times, AI and the admissions world, and sustainability focus, and really a whole lot more. You know us by now, so we're sort of off the cuff and deep thinking, knowledgeable folks. So as always, I'm your host, Bara Sapir. I'm CEO of City Test Prep and Mindflow, and I'm joined by my co-host, Krithika. Hi, Krithika.
Hey, Bara. Hi, Giri. Nice to meet you.
It's great to see you. How are you doing?
Doing pretty amazing.
Awesome. Will you introduce our awesome host? I'm super excited to have him on board.
Absolutely. I have been following Giri's journey for over 3 years now. And it's absolute great pleasure to introduce Giri Kesavan, an alumni from London Business School, and he's currently the Senior Strategy Manager at Sky. And most importantly, he's won a bunch of awards. And the reason for that is because while at LBS, he was a co-president of the Tech and Media Club, and currently also serves as a superstar student ambassador. And to borrow the words of David Morris, Head of Technology and Media Careers at LBS, Giri has truly created lasting impact. He established a technology steering group consisting of faculty, career center, alumni, and various school departments to champion the world of technology as a career for LBS students. This led to the creation of a new concentration called the Technology and Analytics concentration, which was added to the MBA program. And because of this, it led to record 20% full-time employment for the MBA 2020 in tech and 44% in MBA 2021. And I'm sure that since then, the numbers have gone up. No wonder that Giri was one of the only students to get the Executive Director's Award for creating such lasting positive impact. So Giri, really excited to have you today.
Great. Thanks very much. Glad to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
And Giri, I would like to kick this off with one important consideration. So I know your passion for tech and media and how you brought it. In the past few months, we've seen the tech world rocked by layoffs of an unprecedented kind, and clearly, it's undergone a lot of shakeups. So with no sign of any foreseeable change in the macroeconomic environment in the coming days, how should one view this if they want to move to the tech sector?
Sure. So I'll also qualify that by sort of what the purpose of an MBA is in that kind of context as well. So, when I look at sort of my journey sort of through LBS and then coming out, I was targeting the technology sector, yes, from sort of career standpoint. But actually what I was doing was building up a CV where I could demonstrate that I could create impact in any organization, any stage of a company's growth, any sector and any geography. So for students sort of looking already working or looking at the next career move, thinking about sort of how you're framing your CV and your experiences along that lens means that it makes it much easier to sort of switch sectors, go into sort of different roles, try out different things when one sector is doing sort of worse than another, sort of more macroeconomically, and that frankly opens you up to so many more options. The other thing I would say is obviously, when we talk about sort of technology as a whole, even that phrase, the tech sector, actually means so many different things, right? So there could be technology in finance, you've got startups, you've got corporate development, you could have ancillary roles related to sort of product marketing, etc. So all of that from sort of a student angle, making sure that rather than sort of chasing companies, you're focusing on expanding a skill set, which then you can leverage into any sector. And frankly, that will make you indispensable and that will make you sort of stand out from everyone else as well.
Amazing. So, in talking about the CV, even just like backpedaling a tiny little bit about the economy has also slowed down. So B schools are starting to see an inflow of applications. I remember this also happened in 2008. And so how can one stand out in the competitive times, because they can't necessarily develop a whole new program off the cuff the way that you did? So how can they, how do you recommend people, move in a way to really stand out?
So I think a lot of it is about having multiple different data points that showcase sort of who you are personally and professionally. So, I've spoken to sort of many applicants who are considering sort of MBAs, and they have like one thing that's going for them, etc. But thinking about sort of what are sort of the various elements that make up your personal and professional profile, I think is really, really important. So you can draw on different sources of data points to demonstrate different skills when it's needed, right? So you can always flex in certain areas and flex less in other areas. And you can do that depending on sort of the school, depending on sort of the career you're interested in, etc. And I find that to be very useful. The folks that I always feel like struggle is where it's very sort of one track, and it's like, well, that's tricky, right? Because you're putting all your eggs in one basket there. So thinking a bit broader, and in terms of sort of the examples that you're bringing that are holistic, is really, really sort of important to actually sort of stand out. And as we were literally doing sort of the open day on Saturday a few days ago at LBS, and one of the things that I was also saying there, which I'm sure will be echoed by sort of the school, is that being holistic and authentic in this is also really, really key, right? It's like, don't do things just for the sake of it, but actually because you're interested in it and passionate about it. And actually what you'll find is that demonstrating passion is far more important than necessarily even demonstrating delivery, right? If you can talk passionately about a subject, you show you're interested, you show you're sort of getting stuck in, actually that goes a long way.
Can you give some examples of some interesting passions that people have brought forward, or interesting trajectories of things people brought together?
Sure. So, I mean, let me use sort of my own example, right? So, one of the things I really love to do is climbing and trekking. So, one of the examples that I use in my LBS essay and sort of talk about in interviews is my trek out to Kilimanjaro, which was like in 2015, etc. And that might seem a very personal sort of experience, but you always have to look at your experience in the context of what you're applying for, right? In this case, the MBA. So, I can say, one of the things in leading a trek like that teaches me so much about leadership, right? So as an example, you have sort of a goal, which is to reach the summit, but you have to take those incremental steps to get there. So how do you keep the team motivated when, all they see is sort of the end goal, but there's nothing in the middle, right? So how do you actually motivate people? How do you manage your time? How do you deal with sort of difficult circumstances when one person's getting left behind? So actually what you're doing is converting a very personal sort of example into a professional learning and contextualizing your example there. Right? When I'm actually on Kilimanjaro, I'm not thinking, yes, I will use this in my LBS essay and how should I sort of think about it? But reflecting back, I think, is really, really important. So one of the pieces of advice I'd always say when you're applying to business school in general is take that time to actually reflect back on your personal and professional examples. Everything doesn't have to be, I did this and I generated X revenue, right? Like there's so many things that you'll find that you're passionate about personally that you can then frame in a lens that teaches you about leadership and potential for leadership in the future.
It also demonstrates critical thinking, right?
Absolutely.
So it also demonstrates how that thing, like life could be a fractal, and that things can also reflect other aspects of, I mean, you can look at a blade of grass and probably write an amazing essay if you really see something. I mean, I believe that someone did that, right?
And that's the thing, right? Because it's all about perspectives and sort of, the one key phrase that you'll see in any MBA sort of program is the whole point of the degree is actually to provide perspectives, right? So if you need to start that journey yourself by thinking about your own experiences and different perspectives and drawing on that.
Yeah, I just love the whole approach of starting with a clean slate. And, our colleague, Dr. Marlena Corcoran, is also like concurring about your starting with a passion, because I think you summarized it so well in terms of the MBA. And you talked about like incremental steps, and I would say that one of the biggest and toughest steps for many has been definitely the GRE or the GMAT. And
Mhm.
now we see a trend in a lot of people opting for either test waivers when it's available with a few schools, as well as, of course, opting for other alternative tests like GRE and the EA. What's your opinion on the trends?
So I think like in terms of test taking, right? Test taking has always frankly been like for me personally was like the worst part of the application. But actually it teaches you a lot, right? So you're working say 12 hours a day, you're coming home, and frankly the last thing anyone wants to be doing is like sentence correction. Like let's be honest, like you don't want to be doing that. However, what does it actually teach you? It teaches you about sort of absolute time management, right? And sort of prioritization of tasks, and also frankly like Pareto principle, 80-20 rule, right? So I think the way that I sometimes see applicants approaching sort of their test strategy itself is quite interesting in terms of giving me an insight into how they're thinking. Right, like a common question I get is how much time should I spend on tests versus like the other areas of sort of the application. And it's like it depends. Like I hate to say that, but it really depends, right? It depends on your prioritization, what other data points you've got in your application, etc. I think looking for sort of alternative testing strategies definitely makes sense, because you also want to play to your strengths, right? So if you know, for example, that in the GRE you're naturally sort of better at that type of test, you play to your strengths, right? So, and in all of this, as always, in an entire application, you're leveraging your strengths and putting your best foot forward. So any way that you can do that, absolutely sort of take advantage of that. I'd say the one thing I would caveat though is, don't expect sort of all schools to offer sort of test waivers as such. And people might say, what can you possibly learn from sort of a single test versus like an entire application, right? It is a data point, but it's a standardized data point. And I think that's quite useful because it kind of shows where everyone is on sort of a very standardized sort of plane, right? So I'm sure schools find that useful in terms of admissions, etc. But don't let that, it's a data point, but don't let it be a defining sort of data point, sort of as it were, of sort of any application, I think. But treat it as an opportunity to again flex your strengths and go along with that.
Since this is this pool that the pond that I swim in, I love everything that you've said. And the thing is that it's a reasoning test, and it is a data point, and it is coachable, and you can improve, and it winds up being a learning opportunity, exactly like what you said. And so if you look at it with that growth mindset of like, what am I going to get out of this, and how can I make the best of this situation? I mean, the GMAT to me is something that is a little bit more slippery. Like the questions are a little bit less overt in how they're asking the questions and what they're actually able to track. It's a reasoning test, whereas the GRE is a bit more, because it is more general and so many programs accept it. It winds up being, it's just a different kind of test, and figure out which one you do better on. But if people who are listening who are interested in the GRE and the GMAT, we are going to have another episode soon that really gets into the weeds with this. So with someone from ETS. So please, definitely tune in then about it. But it is important. It's an important consideration for schools, and it's an important consideration for you as an applicant, and you really can shine. Like, it doesn't take that much work. I mean, it's a lot of work. Mind you, I've been in the business for 30 years. It is a lot of work, but relatively speaking, it's the one thing that you can really change, that and the essays. Like, you can't change your grades.
Yeah.
You can't change your work experience, right? So you can change how you present and the perspective, but it's something that you really have some agency over in the moment.
And I think, like, just quickly, one thing I really like about actually the GMAT, for example, is if you look at sort of the GMAT, right, you have the official book, nice fat book with all those questions. Anyone given time can answer all of those questions. It is not a test of knowledge, i.e. it is not a test of what you should think. It is a test of how you think, right? So your test taking strategy is about the how, not the what. And in any MBA program, the fundamental learning outcome is not telling you what to think. We don't go into a classroom and say, here's the case, this is what you will think and learn. the whole point is to teach you how to think, and really the test and the test taking strategies are part of that, right? So, you've got a problem which can be solved in many ways, and under different constraints, but what it's teaching you is how you actually think, how you solve it quickly, how you do it in certain ways. And I think that's great preparation for when you're actually in a sort of an MBA program.
There's definitely a political joke in there that I'm not going to make about what's going on in the United States right now, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go there. So following suit, it seems like the AI generated writing is a big, huge topic. I know in the test prep world, we're talking about it a lot. The admissions consulting world is talking about it a lot. So how do you think that the AI generated writing is going to change the world of MBA admissions?
So I think a lot of it, so for example, I could go onto ChatGPT and say, hey, write me an admissions essay. It would be very factual, but what it won't be is authentic. And I think, frankly, I find it very easy to sort of be authentic in sort of interviews and so on, right? And in terms of what I write, etc., it flows very, very naturally. So I'm sure that people reading sort of these types of essays can actually sort of see that as well, to be honest. So focusing on being authentic, I think, is absolutely key, and no AI is going to sort of help you do that. Where it could be interesting is how to sort of structure your essay, so you can kind of see where things are sort of structured. But ultimately, like, it's your writing. And also, I would say, if you're submitting something that's sort of AI generated, frankly, all of these schools will have very in-depth sort of interview processes where, again, in the classroom, it's not really setting you up for success, right? Because you're going to be asked your opinion about a topic. You're not going to have help. You're going to rely on sort of your own skills, your intuition, and drawing in from your background. The other thing I would say is that it's frankly like very hard for sort of AI generated tools to write like a good essay, I think, because if I look at sort of, the types of things that I wrote in my LBS essay, some part of it was, the specific elements of the school that were really useful to me, right? Like London Cap, etc. Those are things that you can find, on the website, etc. Right? Like, what are the elements of the program that is unique about LBS that you'll be able to sort of find? What it doesn't tell you, though, is how are you going to create impact, right? Which is ultimately, became actually a huge focus of my LBS application. A lot of it was about, okay, I have a background in tech. These are sort of the areas where I think the school can sort of improve. So this is how I'm creating impact. So again, focusing on sort of the how, and also the conversations that I've had with various people and what sparked that sort of interest in the program, right? That cannot be automated. So I think there's actually, still a huge scope for sort of individuality and that authenticity that just cannot be replicated.
Yeah, and to your point, like how you said the GMAT or the GRE itself and how you prep for those tests are a way of helping you develop those critical thinking and other skills. I think personally the essay is something which really helps you introspect. And to me, the essays are always the tools that you use to shape the narrative. And so I would say that like ChatGPT is going to help somebody who's probably in, say, like, a 20% to maybe a 50%, but then that's it. It's just going to bring somebody to an average essay at the, in the worst case. But then again, like, you also had thousands of essays lying around that you had access to even before ChatGPT. But I would say that maybe it's going to increase the operational bandwidth for some of the schools, and therefore they have like additional steps in order to obviously check for these, as well as maybe they're going to rely more on video assessments.
Yeah, I think video assessments is an interesting one because obviously it's, again, teaching. It's training sort of how you're thinking in sort of the moment, right? It's like, you're asking me a question which is unscripted, like, what is my response? I'll have sort of, limited time to sort of prep for that. I think that's a very useful way to quickly test whether someone is like structured, articulate, has an opinion and doesn't like sit on the fence, and crucially can draw from their previous background, into their own experience. because that's what you're doing in the classroom, right? And I always tell, whenever I speak to people about LBS, I always tell them the amount of times in a classroom context where I've gone, oh, during my time at company X, I did this, and I think it can be applicable to this case. How are you ever going to get like AI replicating that type of answer? You just can't, right? So it's again about sort of framing your own experiences rather than picking them off a shelf. And I think there's still sort of huge scope for that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Totally. I mean, I think that authenticity piece that you were mentioning, like being authentic and earnest, that along with what personal experience is. I heard an NPR story about how someone had their kid use the AI and talk about like the planets, and somehow they actually got all the facts wrong. They actually didn't have correct information about the planets and their size. And so that 50%, I think that's really useful to think about 20% to 50% improvement. But ultimately, if it's a good structure and crutch to use, it could be a great learning tool for people as well, So it might have that experience.
I think it's useful for frameworks, but not useful for like individuality, etc., because that can't be replicated.
Yeah. So looking at like getting more of a wider view, what would you say? How can students get more out of the MBA experience itself?
So I think like the main sort of thing with the MBA is, when you're researching schools, you'll obviously have sort of, okay, here are sort of the specific elements that are unique to sort of that school. And I think the first thing is, at the start of the MBA journey, you might think that all schools are the same, but actually every school is actually very, very different in terms of what they're trying to achieve, what the student culture is like. So you almost need to find that fit as well, right? So it's not just about a list of things that the school can give you. The really sort of interesting sort of element, I think, comes in, and this is why sort of frankly I chose LBS, and I always say this to people, it is a school where I knew I could make impact, right? I'm here, I want to get here, LBS is in the middle, but actually more than that, I know that I can create change and create sort of impact. That's when it gets a lot more interesting, because you're learning new things, right? I'm basically treating LBS, my MBA, as less of, oh, I come here and you guys, I learn a few things, I tick all these program requirements and I get a degree. It changes that to, oh, I come here, you're giving me a platform, we're going to collaborate together and build something unique and craft a journey that at the end, it's not sort of the degree, the program office giving me a degree certificate. It's more, oh, we earned this together, right? In a partnership between students and staff and alumni and faculty. That gets you a lot more. That's how I think you get a lot more out of sort of the experiences, to really lean in to seeing, oh, I'm not just going to take things at face value. I'm not just going to take opportunity, but I'm going to create opportunity. And the process of creating opportunity itself is a great learning experience, because it allows you to apply what you're learning in the classroom in real time, to add real impact to your fellow students as well. And ultimately, that's very, very rewarding.
I completely love that perspective. The other day, we were just talking about networking, where we said that, hey, it's all about give and take, and the more you give, the more you get. And I think that's also something B schools want. And I can see you, like, I love the fact that you said it's more of a partnership. And this, I think, is how you're being authentic, by not listing and by not saying, but by saying that, hey, what can I offer to you? And that mindset shift that happens is exactly when you become a leader, which I think is the purpose of the program. So hearing about that, see, and I know one more important trend that is so critical for all of us, and it's going to impact all of us, is sustainability. And in fact, like more and more specialty sustainability degrees are cropping up, as they should. And in fact, like I just went through a PwC survey, which said that 70% of Gen Zers are more likely to work for a company with a strong green footprint. So is this a trend that's going to pick up pace in 2023?
So I definitely think like sustainability has come to the front as sort of a at top of mind, right, for many sort of schools, etc., and for many students, etc. People are a lot more interested now in not only how, like, what is being delivered, but how it's being delivered, right? Whether that is ethical, whether that is sustainable, etc. And I think there's a huge opportunity here for sort of business schools to frame that type of thinking as part of an embedded that into sort of the degree. I think it's always dangerous when we say our sustainability, we need like pure courses on sort of sustainability, etc. I think what's actually more powerful is you blend that thinking into existing case studies or create new case studies that look at how companies are tackling sort of that problem. And for example, Alex Edmonds at LBS wrote sort of a fantastic book called Profit and Purpose, and what is, does there need to be sort of a trade-off? So it's having those conversations, which I think will get sort of more and more important. I think what we generally see sort of as a trend, talking to sort of my class and comparing sort of previously, even sort of the sectors that people go into, there are just a lot more metrics now that people use to judge employers by, right? It's not only just about sort of salary, etc. So the KPIs for what people think of is sort of a fulfilling career is quite different, right? And that's different for different people, because the other thing I find interesting about an MBA is you don't find everyone at sort of the same life stage as well, right? So actually understanding what matters most for you and framing your education around that, I think, is really, really key. So thinking about things from that lens and bringing that perspective in. Sustainability is big. Work-life balance is also sort of another one, right? A lot of people are sort of really looking at, what's the new way of working, like hybrid, etc., and so on, and that sort of global mobility that might bring. So these are sort of very new themes that are coming up, right? And there are opportunities to be had sort of in this space as well.
Interesting. I'm thinking also, just as we think about trends, we're all coming out of COVID, right? We're all coming out. I don't know what LBS did during COVID in terms of their learning format, but I know that LBS was one school that emphasized more on experiential learning.
Correct. Yeah.
So focusing on that as opposed to traditional classroom-based teaching, how do you see that trend either happening in the LBS community, or how are they dealing with the post-COVID reality? And are you seeing anything even in other business schools and how they're responding?
Sure. So I think experiential learning is sort of very key. I actually worked with that team sort of a lot, sort of during my time at the school, because I found it personally sort of very interesting, because what you want to apply from the classroom, you want to apply to industry, not only in London, but across the world, right? So, treks, etc., and so on. But it goes beyond sort of these tentpole structured pieces of experiential learning, as it were. So in LBS's case, things like the global experience, etc. It goes way beyond that, right? Experiential learning is about how you're applying what you're learning to industry in a very experiential way. One of the things that I found very interesting during COVID was, of course, people couldn't travel, etc. But the school actually took that opportunity to create a new course, which I actually sort of speak at every semester, called Digital for Impact, where actually we're saying, right, so we can't travel anywhere. Okay, that's obviously like a problem. What we can do, though, is to leverage that, because now everyone can go on Zoom and do conversations like this while I'm still in the office. So we can leverage that by creating sort of a new course to create sort of real life opportunities when we couldn't do it before. So in this case, Digital for Impact basically has sort of groups of students doing remote consulting, all remote, with emerging economies across Africa. So I was doing sort of consulting in a team of 6 across sort of New York, London, and Dubai, sort of 3 sort of campuses where sort of some of our students are at. And we were working with a client in Uganda for 4 months. There is no way on earth that the school would send us to Uganda, obviously, for 4 months, right, and to do that in person. But because of the virtual learning sort of experience, that actually opens up so much more things that you can do sort of experientially, right? So I think what I've seen, certainly one of the things I'm very proud of at LBS, is we really took that not only as sort of, okay, guys, this is a really tough time for the world, but actually, Yes, but also let's take the opportunity to do things that we wouldn't have done in a normal context, and that works out very well. I literally did a session in Digital for Impact sort of a couple of weeks ago, so that's still a course that remains to this day, even though we're all back to sort of physical learning, right? So the learnings from COVID aren't just, oh, let's all go back to normal, but it's about how people use that to create opportunities that didn't exist before, and how those opportunities can continue to exist sort of in the future.
Necessity is the mother of what was
exactly.
it?
Innovation.
Or like,
yeah.
like, and you know, you're coming back to this idea of perspective, which I think is also like, that has been like a trend in this conversation, right? Perspective, opportunity, leadership, taking initiative. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, and I think I think we're not going back ever, and it's going to be the best of both worlds. And I think that's what we have to find, the new normal, as they keep telling. And I'm always of the opinion that you never had a normal. So, but it looks like the students want more and more, and it's going to be, as I said, like. It again, speaking of opportunities, you have so many opportunities and flexibility, and more students that I see want new things. And so how can students adapt and evolve what students want?
So I think like there's sort of several elements here, right? So, and I think it's always a balance. So students want more things, but they also need to help themselves get more things, frankly, right? So yes, there's higher expectations on sort of schools. It's, MBAs are now sort of less transactional. Students are expecting a lot more than just the degree certificate. They're expecting the network, they're expecting the experiences, they're expecting specific jobs, etc. So trying to get away from sort of that very transactional mindset, and having sort of as we said sort of earlier, a growth mindset, I think, is key. Students have high expectations, but they need to help themselves meet that. They shouldn't expect anything on a plate, and I think this is very, very key in terms of perspective, right? A lot of people sort of apply to schools because there's so many things on the menu that they can take part in, but actually what's more interesting is creating a new dish, right? So you're using the kitchen, but you're creating a new dish. So that is how you actually gain more. And when I went into LBS, right, I had the expectation that I was able to do that. I expected to be able to change the program. So that's what I think schools need to sort of consider. It's like you've got a group of students where you have the opportunity to not be transactional, but actually leverage them and work together in partnership to create something unique, and that helps out both sides. What I do see, and sometimes, is that students have very high expectations, they're not quite met, etc. But then I always come back to, so what are you doing about it? So change it, right? Like isn't that why we're here? Isn't that the whole purpose of sort of the program, to affect change in any situation? Go back to my point right at the start. I want to see on a CV like that you can come into any situation, whatever the org structure, whatever the construct, and implement change and create impact. So why not start with business school education while you're there? It's a no-brainer to me, but it's a mindset shift, rather than sort of anything else, I think.
Yeah, and it travels through the entire arc of the applying, being a student, and then professionally. Like, it's just, life is an opportunity to affect change where you see that things need to be improved, right?
Yeah.
So I guess my last question is, are there any other trends that you're seeing, or things that we haven't spoken about that are surprising, or even that we haven't brought up in the MBA world?
So I think like one sort of macro theme that I see sort of going on is obviously the amount of resources that people have at their disposal to sort of find information. I think like that's a huge shift over sort of the last 5 to 10 years, right? So before, I might sort of attend one open day, find the info, write my essay, talk to an alum, etc. But there's so many more opportunities to find information, whether that's connecting with student ambassadors, attending webinars, listening to sessions like this, etc. That's an amazing source of information. But what I think is the trend and the challenge is for people to actually look at the so what. Right, as I talk to sort of many applicants who are like, should I attend like all the sessions? It's like probably not a good use of your time, right? Just because everything's available to you doesn't mean you need to attend everything. Always think about when you're sort of attending an event, etc. What are sort of the key takeaways that I'm looking for? How will that help me in sort of my application? What really interested me in terms of this, profile of a student ambassador, etc., that I want to learn more about, and how can I have a so what? And I think that's really, really sort of key. I always find that people struggle sometimes, when I'm talking to them, to sort of frame what they're saying in terms of, so what does that actually mean for your MBA, right? Like, you learned about this in the open day. So what do you think? Like, what do you actually think it means for sort of your application? So looking at all of these information sources, and finding like, what's the takeaway, what's the so what? Because frankly, that's what you're doing in work, right? Like, there are so many meetings that I get invited to, etc., and I can't attend everything, I can't do everything. So you have to balance your depth versus breadth in terms of research, find what matters most when, and leverage that in your application.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, we have, if you're only gathering information and not spending time with the critical thinking, the information doesn't really do so much for you. I mean, even in testing, right? Like the medical boards and the MCAT, to talk about them. Yeah. And there's even some business schools that accept MCAT. I didn't get to say that earlier, right? But there's a lot of information at the fingertips of doctors all the time. They can get that, but it's the thinking of the relationship. And it's the thinking and the critical thinking and the questioning and prioritizing and that you're talking about in business and in all these fields that make it yummy.
And to be honest, like I was guilty of this at the start, right? I remember like I went to the LBS Open Day, like, maybe to like 2018 now, just wrote like tons of notes on like what I learned. But then you reflect back and you're like, actually, none of that is, some of that is generally not useful, right? It is, it's interesting as sort of fun facts, but it's not actually helping me sort of frame my application or like, so picking the elements which speak most and resonate to you, I think is sort of key. And I think with all of these information sources, finding the time to sort of be reflective and introspect is something that we were talking about in the open day is so key. And I feel like sometimes people just don't have that, right? So building in that time, and these days I think it has to be very consciously built in sometimes, right? Where actually you're moving at 100 miles an hour, but actually reflecting back and identifying the so what's is actually sort of hard, right? And my LBS essay was written actually in a cafe in Taiwan, because I was doing like a solo trip, because I was like, in a normal work setting, I'm going so fast that I literally don't have the mental headspace to go back, reflect, do all the things that we talked about earlier in the chat about sort of the so what does it mean? How do I connect the dots? So almost thinking to yourself as a first step, like, what environment do I need to create so that I can take all of these, like this flow of information, and structure it, crystallize it, identify what matters is actually itself a key skill, and will be a key skill going forward.
Yeah, I just love that. And I'm going to give a quick analogy. I always tell people, like, think of it like going to a buffet and you're going to pick what you want to eat. So even though it's the same for everybody, you probably are taking more of something versus the other. Like, I just love that perspective of what you put there.
Yeah. I think we often talk about why, like, what's your why? What's like, even in test prep, which feels like it's a very singularly driven thing. Like, well, I want to get a great score, but why? Like, why? What is that going to do for you? Like, you have the bigger picture is so much more interesting than that number, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us, Giri.
No worries.
That's all that we really have time for in this episode. Cool. And I also want to thank Krithika and, of course, the audience, everyone who's joined us, Dr. Marlena Corcoran. Like, it's so great to have your comment on here, as always. And we're excited to have, like I said, our audience join us. And if you like this episode or other episodes, please give us a thumbs up. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you have any questions, about this topic, or if you'd like to suggest topics for future episodes, we'll definitely get back to you. So to subscribe to MBA Waves, stay on top of all the latest trends by following us and in the news of the world of MBAs, business and education. And don't forget to check us out next week, the same place and the same time, for full access to the upcoming and past episodes. Go to mbawaves.com. I'm just slipping up completely on this outro, but I want to say goodbye to everyone. Next week, it's what's on the GRE and why is it being tested. So please join us for that. And everyone have a great week. And thank you so much again.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.